Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 40th episode of By-The-Bywater. Great to be back here with you. This is our emergency re-record episode. We won't bore you with the details, but there was file madness. So this is going to sound...
got into it.
It did. It's going to sound maybe a little different than the usual ones. There's not going to be my usual hyper edit on this thing. So if you hear a lot more crosstalk and randomness and especially background noise, because I'm already hearing the band that plays around here on Saturday afternoons starting to tune up. So if you hear any extra music, that's what's going on. So, but call it the beauty mark. It'll be fun. The other thing we'll talk about this episode is the continuing adventures of Oriana and the forklift that tried to kill her.
Right? Although I can't, I suppose I now can't talk too publicly about it. But yeah, there was a forklift that hit our car, and that's a whole fun thing to deal with in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So we'll steer clear to preserve Oriana's legal options for the discussion. But we will encourage you, as always, to check out the main podcast on our network that is called It's Just a Show about Mystery Science Theater 3000, which is why the network exists in the first place. Because as soon as our blog pod network overlord Chris heard about this, he immediately referenced a certain song wherein someone is trying to kill someone else by trying to kill him with a forklift. I will provide a link in the show notes. So
I still haven't actually listened to it.
Yeah, it's not quite like that what happened to Oriana, and she is fine, and everyone is fine, but anyway.
Or, we did walk away. That is the phrasing.
There. That's a very good way of putting it.
We walked away.
And legal weirdness will happen when it does. Okay, so again,
we're happening.
Yeah. So we're under the gun, kind of. But we can get to this, and we actually are sort of weirdly glad in one respect regarding the re-record, because we're able to incorporate some really just happened a few days ago news, which is great, rather than having to worry about it for next time. So we'll just ask Jared to take us into what has been a fairly busy news month. So Jared, please. Take it away.
Yeah, it's been a very busy month with all kinds of news. So we'll start with the biggest one. The Tolkien estate has announced a new book to be published at the end of the year, The Fall of Numenor. Originally planned by Christopher Tolkien, well-known Tolkien enthusiast Brian Sibley has taken on the final editing of this volume, which is meant to be a collation of Tolkien's writings on that subject in its various forms, with accompanying illustrations by Alan Lee. It's unclear whether this means we might be getting a further series of books doing similar work across the legendarium, but given that this writing obviously covers the stated subject matter of the Amazon series, whatever the book's origins, the fact that it's coming out in as close to a tie-in book as possible is hardly accidental, and we'll definitely have much more to say about it after its release. Yeah, I'm thinking entire episode. But speaking of the Amazon series, while no new trailer has emerged as of recording, as of this recording, though there was a very weirdly cringy general promo video that implies we might also be getting some Ents, plus a separate shorter video trying to play up a man-elf drama. A few weeks back, there was a major set of stories in Empire magazine, along with some more official photos and character identification, mostly covering the Harfoot characters. Also, we're getting more of a low-key promo push where various behind-the-scenes folks are being interviewed, such as dialect coach Leith McPherson and prosthetic department head Jimmy Wilson, both veterans of the Jackson films. Among other information that surfaced is a somewhat curious statement about how Quenya might be used as a language of magic. Well, more concretely and notably, there will be female orc characters and other potential new elements about that species that could lead to different portrayals. We'll find out more in 2 months. And finally, looking longer term, the Warner Brothers anime The War of the Rohirrim has taken a major step forward with casting announcements for its key characters, with Miranda Otto reprising her role as Éowyn, acting as narrator for a story from Rohan's earlier history. The major names include Brian Cox as Helm Hammerhand, Sean Dooley as Helm's earlier enemy Freka, Luke Pasqualino as Freka's vengeful son Wolf, Lawrence Ubong Williams as Helm's eventual heir Freyalaf, and, as the first wholly new character we know about created for the film, Gaia Wise as Hera, Helm's Helm's daughter, described as a resistance leader in the wake of Wolf's attack. We'll get into Hera. There's an extensive interview the OneRing.net did with Philippa Boyens about a lot of this. We'll link to it in the show notes. Some more concept art has surfaced as well, with further details, including a confirmation that not only is John Howe working on design, but so is Alan Lee, fully reuniting that team. Whereas Richard Taylor is also credited in turn. As previously known, Kenji Kamiyama is directing, while animation studio Sola Digital Arts, known most recently for the work on Blade Runner Black Lotus, which also starred Brian Cox, is currently working on animation for April 24 release.
That's a lot of news. So
That's so much.
So yeah, let's get into the interview that Philippa Boyens gave to the OneRing.net the other day, because there were thoughts on our end about the new character here.
Yeah, the Hera thing, I can't remember if this was like previous recording or a previous episode, but Hera was announced and we were like, that's a Greek name. What's up with that? And then in the Boyens interview, she's like, it's Hera, but it's spelled with an accent mark over the E as a nod to the Anglo-Saxon whatever. And I was like, you can't just do that. You can't just make so. So I was like, okay, is this a real thing? Because most of the Rohan names actually mean things. So I pulled up an Old English dictionary, and Hera means something like servant or like slave, or it's like subservient to. And I was like, are you kidding me? This guy put so much thought into the names for these people. And yeah, some of them were like in jokes in some ways, like Aoral just meaning like guy in charge, you know. But Hera, did you look this up? And it's what's hilarious to me too is that it's in grammatical gender terms, it is a weak masculine now. It's not a woman's name. It's literally a masculine. Anyway,
when you associate it with, and we'll talk more about this in the sound, you know, our main topic, there is some sort of sound symbolism stuff that we'll talk about, but names mean things, and
especially in this universe,
right? And you can't simply name a character, a female character in particular, a name that is most commonly associated in our culture with Greek mythology.
Yes.
You can't then insist that it is a nod to the Anglo-Saxon, which is
because you put a little accent mark on it.
Like, no. And second of all, look at what the Anglo-Saxon actually means. Look at the grammatical gender of it. I know that, you know, grammatical gender and gender are not the same,
totally
but they
separate,
do like. It's not a great idea to if you're going to do that, if you're going to name a female character with a sort of grammatically masculine word, it needs to have a reason. It should mean something. It should be like a genuine subversion. And it's not, and it's...
And I mean, there is also the possibility that my dictionary is misleading me. I don't know, but like...
Sure.
I checked a couple of them.
It feels incorrect. And once again, we'll get more into why it matters that things feel correct when you're dealing with language in this way. Like,
it's also baffling coming from Boyens herself, because you know, screenwriter for the Jackson trilogy. I can't remember if she worked on The Hobbit, but like this is somebody who I assumed had like really deep respect for all aspects of this.
Didn't she do the translation into Adunaic of some?
She might have done. She definitely of her, Jackson, and Fran Welsh. She is the one who was the actual hyper Tolkien fan. Above all three of them, unquestionably. So. So yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, and if it sounds like we're just utterly confused, it is the fact that having been so relatively good and focused on the background details throughout, it's a bit of a skew-whiff thing. And we do want to emphasize again, if you're not familiar with the Helm Hammerham story, which is buried again in the appendices for Return of the King, all the other names of all the other characters there are named by Tolkien. So this is literally the new character that we know of, and there will be other ones, I'm sure, created for the film. So it is the first new name, and that is a bit skew-whiff. And the Greek element, to my mind, oddly enough, just however accidental, just makes me think of the other character name revelation we had the other month for the Amazon series, where one character's name is Theo.
Yeah.
which has its own Greek associations, even though you can more tie that in with Theoden, which is, I guess, what they're trying to go for. But still, it
There's
has
that,
this.
and Ned, you have been kind of fixating on Poppy Proudfellow, which I completely concur with your fixation.
Are we talking about the Amazon series now? Let's shift to that news.
Right. It's a nice little segue. It's a nice little segue of like, here's some other stuff that sounds really weird. Like all of the names that we have gotten for the hobbits in particular feel, the Hobbit names that we see in the Lord of the Rings are, Tolkien is translating them from, sort of you can tell, but these just feel like a name generator online.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, there's something.
I think I stole that from you, Jared. You came up with that. You came up with a name generator thing.
Maybe I did. I don't know. They're fun, but you shouldn't use them for.
You should be very cautious.
Specifically.
It's the alliteration, I think, that the Poppy Proudfellow thing. So Bilbo Baggins is an alliterative name, but it's kind of the only alliterative name that we have in among the hobbits in particular, and that's because it was a character named while he was part of a children's story where alliteration is a whole thing. Kids love that, but it doesn't really it feels out of place in a work like Lord of the Rings. You don't Frodo is Frodo Baggins. Pippin took Poppy Proudfellow feels like a bad fanfic name.
Yeah, it definitely feels like an imitation of an imitation, and it's
yes. If you told me it was a shorter Shannara character, it'd be like, yeah, sure,
yeah.
And part of the reason for me it rings so false is not just name generator alliteration and all that. It's that the other names too are like this, where they're clearly just going through the appendices, looking at family trees, and being like, we'll pull that element and mash it with this element. And I'm sure their thinking is like, oh, this is, these strains then combine to form the hobbits that we all know and love.
Yeah.
But that's not how it works. One of the other characters is something Brandyfoot or something, and that doesn't make any sense in the context of anything here.
It's not just Eleanor Nori Brandyfoot, which ooh, that's not enough.
Eleanor's you're just naming that because there's another Eleanor in the thing. They
and
don't
it's
know
that's
why
that's
do they know about that?
Sindarin name. That's I guess maybe they'll have significant contact with the Sindarin elves, but
it specifically grows in Lothlorien, right?
Right.
I don't think shows up it also doesn't it also grow in in Gondor in Lebanon or something.
Oh, maybe. But also
maybe,
are the hobbits there? What
are
is
they there? It's a lot.
Yeah, there. I mean, we'll see how they use the map. That's for sure. And yeah, no, we there's the brief bit of ints in that one fan promo video thing, which we had issues with because the mom in that one, because it is supposed to be about a young Tolkien fan, and the mom in that one, who is meant to be dare I say around Jared and Oriana's age here, let's say mid-30s, is all sort of oh, you're reading about your pixies again, and it's Mom?
Nobody says pixie. People default to elves. My dad even defaults to elves, and he doesn't even like the Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings movies were the biggest movies, not of all time, but the biggest movies of the
certainly
culture
of our youth.
Yeah, No one is talking about pixies anymore.
You might say pixie dust or fairy dust, but you don't you wouldn't be oh, pixies you
themselves.
Off to see your pixie movie or whatever when you're talking about Lord of the Rings.
What is this?
And it's just so weird because I mean this is something I don't think we actually talked about this first time, but stepping back, that promo video also has a feeling of you doth protest too much. It's sort of we're now several decades into what can be called a wider fandom in a very broad sense, crossing all medias and covering many different, let's be blunt, franchises, and it's sort of if you don't quite get that people like do this on a regular basis and are involved with things, I don't know what to say to you anymore.
It's really like I don't know, like the 80s or something.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're doing nerd stuff. Okay, it's that kind of like you're not persecuted, you guys. You won the culture war. You don't.
Yeah, I mean, you see stuff like that now if you're watching Stranger Things, which is explicitly set in the 80s, Yeah. But we are not. So we're talking about this. So yeah, no, it is a it's a very odd approach to that. And then there was a separate little promo video that they actually threw out in the last few days, which was another sort of like new thing that we're able to talk about where basically, shock, surprise, Galadriel's an elf because of her ears.
What?
It felt very, it was like, the impression I'm getting from the marketing that they're doing is that it's sorry. I'm just like really annoyed at this guy I've gotten mad at in my mind. So like,
darn you.
It feels like the vibe they're going for is that like humans and elves are like hate each other in this setting. And it's like even in the Third Age when they're supposedly way more estranged, humans don't hate elves. They just kind of like maybe fear them at most.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, oh, Lady of the Golden Wood, but they also, that's specific to hating Galadriel or fearing her or whatever. It's not elves in general.
No, most of them just don't come in contact with them. If they do,
they're like, oh, see them in the woods in the distance or whatever.
They're going, ooh, the pretty people are going away.
Yeah.
All right.
But this feels like human elf hostility that is not present in anything except, I don't know, when Elrond talks in the movies and he's like, men are weak. And it's like, why are you saying this? You're just creating drama. Like, it's such a weird choice. If that's the choice that they have made, but from what they are putting out, that's the choice that it feels like they've made to me.
Yeah.
And this may also be done partially to play up the, Ismael Cruz Cordova and Nazanin Boniati's characters, who are the male elf and the female woman human woman who apparently have a thing going on. So maybe the whole idea is to contrast one versus the other. I do not know, because it's unclear exactly how connected or coordinated this all is. These could all be separate stories. The one thing I'm suddenly thinking about again is the idea that this first season is supposed to set up everything, which is like, I mean, that's an issue. And then other issues. So Quenya as magic.
Oh, right. God.
We're still wondering about that quote from Leith McPherson.
It's not even a quote.
Because it was a paraphrase,
Was it a paraphrase? Okay, I wasn't too sure.
Yeah, it was part of the body of the article itself.
Right,
the writer was
like
explaining, heavy air quotes, like, oh, in this setting, Quen is being used as a language of for spellcasting, I think.
Right? Oh, spellcasting, yes.
Specifically spellcasting, and we were wondering if they misheard somebody say language of ritual, which is what Quenya is in some contexts, and heard that as, oh, ritual, okay, magic ritual, got it, and went with that, but we don't know.
We have no idea. I could see a game of telephone in which someone in the production, possibly even Leith themselves, is like, it's sort of, Quenya is equivalent to Latin, you hear it in Mass, but you don't hear it, it is not everyday speech. It's not the vernacular. And seeing that go through, like, first the writer writes, does her little paraphrase, or his, I don't remember who wrote the article, but the writer does their little paraphrase, and then an editor who does not know anything about this, which is often what happens, does their little pass, and it gets just totally, they're like, like ritual, so like spells, magic, elves are magic, they do spells, and like it just getting completely divorced from the reality, possible, or no one cares, or just like no one involved actually cares.
Well, it's interesting to compare it to in Fellowship of the Ring, the movie. Quenya notably shows up in, I think, only a few times, and the only one that I can remember off the top of my head is when Saruman is calling down a storm upon Caradhras. But so there's that. But in the books themselves, if you had only read the books, you would think Sindarin was the language of magic, because that's the one Gandalf uses when he's like, fire in the logs, or
Edro,
or Melon at the gates. Like, that's the only one that ever gets really used. So how do you come away with Quenya being the one? If you're, again, maybe you just saw that one scene in Fellowship of the Ring and you're like, cool, I guess that's how it works.
Elvish is like not even really fully like understanding the difference between the two, like just
You can say. And then, of course, we've got the female orcs and the orcs in general. How they're being set up.
Interested.
Very
that
interesting.
seems cool. That's like the one thing I'm like, oh hell yeah, female orcs, because like go back and listen to our orc episode. I think it's a really good one. And I'm not just saying that because I think it was my topic, but like
it was. Yeah, it was. It was a good episode too.
It was a very good episode.
Really interesting. And if you listen to that episode, you'll see exactly how unsettled the actual origin of the orcs is. Tolkien himself like waffled a lot on whether they are beasts, whether they are fully incarnate people with souls, how the origin of their evil, how they reproduce, and so having female orcs, that's like fascinating. It's like it points to a very concrete direction, and that's something that I'm really interested to see.
Yeah, and the other orc thing that I'm interested to see is they specifically talk about the orcs starting the show as like they've almost been exterminated. They're just like scattered bands, and I think you could take this in a really interesting direction of like, given that orcs are more or less supposed to be metaphors of like fascism or nationalism, like just blind nationalism, kind of, we're all orcs in the Great War and all that. So then you have this opportunity to be like, well, these orcs, if left to their own devices, might be just fine. But then Sauron rises and is like, hey, those elves, they really did a number on you. You want to join me? Maybe we could punish them for that.
They're still hunting you down like animals.
Which, that's on the elves for sure. Like,
I will make that not happen anymore.
Yeah. And then you could really dig into why these kind of movements of resentment arise and become so powerful, especially united under one charismatic leader. There's absolutely no parallels to draw with the real world.
Don't know what you're talking about.
It's like, I don't know, it's pure fantasy, but you know,
applicability,
there's a lot that you could
allegory.
do there. Yeah. There's a lot you could do with that. I don't know if I trust these people to do it, but I'd be interested. I know, right? But I'd be interested to see if they are trying.
Right?
At least makes the attempt.
I'll take an attempt.
Yeah.
Be good.
Or, I mean, I say that now. Maybe
right.
When it comes down
to
it.
We'll find out. We'll find out all too soon. And before we get into our main topic, the one other thing, yes, a new Tolkien book. We are moving further into the world of post-Christopher Tolkien Tolkien collections, if you will. He apparently did do some early work on this. And to have something as The Fall of Numenor out there, I think is just a really smart decision by the estate. Not merely does it tie in very directly with the series, so that way if someone asks, well, where's the story coming from, you can be like, here, and essentially point to
reference
that. Book. Yeah, at least there's something to reference. I mean, because remember, as we have found out in the continual about the legal situation here, which is still boggling my mind in terms of rights, is that while there is plenty of writing that has been published posthumously from Tolkien about Numenor, apparently the only Numenor stuff they can actually fully use is what's in the appendices, which is not that much. So, so it's a weird combination of extrapolation and other things, and we will see what results. But since it is buried in there, and all that, this is a very handy way for at least the estate, if not necessarily the Amazon Productions. It's not like, the cover of this book is not a Amazon series Rings of Power tie-in. Thankfully it is keeping in line with all the rest of the more recent ones, the 21st century, could say, posthumous book collections that have been done, starting with the Children of Hurin, where we have art from Alan Lee, which is wonderful. Well, I can't wait for that. Alan Lee doing art all about Numenor, I am down for. This is good.
God,
that is something.
So into it.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a couple of other examples of other things over time. A couple things from Ted Naismith. It's not like there's an unknown subject for Tolkien artists, but a whole ream of art from him, from Alan Lee about this. We are jazzed, and it'll be a good sort of nice new key edition. to pull things together. There may be nothing utterly new in it at all. I mean, some of the sound of it is just simply assembling all the stuff from all over the place. But that's a lot of stuff. And that may even include, I kind of hope it does, Aldarian and Arendis, that wonderful story, which we talked about way back in our 4th episode, and is something that even if they don't have the rights to do in the series, and it looks like they're not going to, just in terms of the timeline alone, it just isn't going to happen. Boy, it'd be nice if someone did that at some point. So, who knows?
I'm gonna throw it out into the universe here. You have a screenwriter right here on this podcast who just went through the Warner Brothers TV Writers Workshop and has the bona fides to help you develop this project about Numenor. I'll do it. Just let me. Okay.
Letting the
Plea
world out
over.
there know. And now you know. So there's a lot coming up. The anime film won't be, of course, for a couple of years, but we are now essentially 2 months away from the Rings of Power series.
Oh,
yeah, 2 months from today. We're recording this on July 2nd, so here it comes, and I'm sure by the time we record our next episode, there'll be even more stuff will start to surface and all that, so we will get to that. But we should get to our main topic as we barrel on along, so we'll do that. It is my choice this time, and so I will begin. In the same way that On Fairy Stories, which we discussed in our episode on Tree and Leaf earlier this year, is a key text for understanding how Tolkien thought about creative works in fantasy, what they draw on, and what can interest him in particular in both how they're written and received, his separate piece, A Secret Vice, is also very central to Tolkien's conception of himself as a creator and an artist, exploring his love not simply of languages, but his own invented languages in particular. Like On Fairy Stories, it was written and delivered as a lecture, in this case at an Oxford Literary Society in 1931, and so captures a moment where he already had much creative work completed for his legendarium, but well before the more familiar forms of it were known. Originally published in 1983 as part of the Christopher Tolkien-edited The Monsters and the Critics and Other Essays, in 2016, well-known Tolkien academic Dimitra Fimi, in collaboration with her fellow academic and Tolkien appreciator Andrew Higgins, published a detailed critical edition. It's this edition we're specifically talking about here, as in both the text and the editor's discussion of it, there's much to think about in terms of not merely how Tolkien thought about these subjects, but the framing and context of his conclusions and arguments. If you're a casual fan of The Lord of the Rings in particular, maybe more attuned to the films than the books, you'll likely know that Tolkien was an English professor who taught at Oxford, and that he had a particular interest in languages, all of which is perfectly true, but it also understates. Tolkien wasn't simply a general literature scholar, but a trained philologist, whose 2 main academic posts at Pembroke and then Merton colleges over time were due to his interest in research in those areas, teaching courses on Anglo-Saxon, Old English, and Middle English languages and literature, among other duties and commitments. Such interest grew out of his own childhood passion for languages in general, which grew into a wider range of general knowledge of many languages. Besides Greek and Latin, standard requirements for many students of Tolkien's generation, he further learned about everything from Gothic to Icelandic to Finnish and Welsh. The latter 2 languages are, famously, the general origin points for Tolkien's 2 most important invented languages, Quenya and Sindarin, 2 Elvish dialects in particular. Tolkien invented almost as many languages as he knew, ranging from small samples of often untranslated dialogue to the complex and ever-evolving dictionaries and grammars that he worked on over decades, often in combination with relevant alphabets in turn. This too grew out of childhood interests in creating languages of his own, sometimes in the company of others, but increasingly as an individual interest as he grew older, and eventually began the initial poems that would lead to the Book of Lost Tales and everything that followed afterward. As Tolkien himself was very clear about over time, the legendarium would not have emerged without these interests and initial efforts in language construction, and thus are part and parcel of its full creative sweep. The inclusion of initial information about them in Lord of the Rings via the appendices further grounded the idea that the book was not so much written as translated, as we discussed in our previous episode. As noted, A Secret Vice is written not for an audience that knows anything about this creative work, as would have been the case regardless in 1931 outside of family and a very close circle of associates. The literary society Tolkien presented to, the Johnson Society, had a general focus on literary efforts past and present, and the notes of subsequent discussion after the essay was delivered included James Joyce and Gertrude Stein, then at the height of their initial fames in the realm of linguistic experimentation, a reflection that the essay is best considered as arguing a corner in a wider context rather than simply an insular self-celebration, even if it is at numerous points, because this essay is certainly tinged with Tolkien's infinite capacity for self-amusement, with discussions of his past in the third person at points, the story of his fellow World War I soldier who he suddenly discovers to be a similarly passionate soul when it comes to invented languages, and almost feels too perfectly illustrative, perhaps. But as an accounting of his own general history and what he had created up to that point, along with various samples of what he had done in that vein, it's a very valuable and thoughtful read. The context that Fimi and Higgins bring in further, however, give pause for thought in terms of how Tolkien's thoughts about languages in general, creative or not, are shaped by assumptions that have fallen out of academic or wider understanding, and could themselves reflect, however unconsciously, deeper biases. An important point considered in the essay is the concept of sound symbolism, posing this in contrast to the school of Saussurian structural linguistics, which later became the driving force of linguistics in general. Sound symbolism's claim, rooted in particularly Western philosophical and religious traditions of the idea of a pure, true language, combined with a belief in language being reinforced by aesthetics, that certain sounds are the aptest or truest for the relevant words, concepts, objects, and so forth. An accompanying short fragment of various thoughts by Tolkien included in the critical edition, Essay on Phonetic Symbolism, goes into this further, with various notes and conclusions that at points do seem to show him to strain at conclusions as much as they provide a guide into his thoughts. Meantime, there's also the context for the wave of invented languages in general that had been in place in Europe for some decades beforehand, most famously Esperanto, as well as Volapük, Novial, and more besides, which Tolkien both addresses in positive and questioning terms, arguing that without a true folklore as such, a language itself cannot thrive, something which he would probably say would explain why his own invented languages retain the interest they do. There's much more to say about all this and other factors worth considering, and we'll get to that in our discussion. But to conclude this introduction, while revised at later times and further for its posthumous publication, A Secret Vice remains an invaluable look into Tolkien's thoughts on his creative work and approach to it at a moment when he would have no sense of what the result would be. That would only be, to quote the original title of his lecture, a hobby for the home, something that, while on different levels than his concurrent children's stories and poems, would be simply that kind of a private pleasure. Thankfully, of course, that turned out not to be the case, but that also makes this a good spot to end on. Time for me to open up the floor, and I'll turn to Oriana first, if you don't mind, because you wrote the essay, a piece, rather, for Vox, was it? On constructed language conlang. So you've had a chance to sort of delve into this from your own perspective and things like that. So with that in mind, given now you've read Tolkien's thoughts, having interviewed other people and profiled other people who were working on their own creative languages, where do you take it? What struck you from here?
It is, first of all, Ned, I want to thank you for having us read this specific edition, because I found the intro to be as valuable as the essay itself. That sounds a little odd, but truly the context given is really fascinating, and I recommend to anyone listening that you find yourself a copy, this specific copy, mine, come to my house and take it from me, I guess. But yeah, it is really interesting to go back to kind of the start of constructed languages themselves, obviously, but the piece I wrote for Vox was about languages created for works of art, basically, and specifically like film and television. I wanted to kind of marry the perspective of the people creating the languages with the people who decide that the languages need to be created in the first place. Why would you do that? It's expensive and time consuming, and it's like a real headache for everyone involved. And it is to give your work a richness that it's. My husband and I were watching GoldenEye the other day, and in it, the Russians don't speak Russian, even when it's just two Russian people talking. And your mind snags on that. And maybe 20 or 30 years, it would be less of a problem. But now, we're in an age of, no, that doesn't sound right. These people should be speaking in their native tongue. And I forget where I was going with this. Oh, no. Oh, God. I've just completely lost my train of thought. Anyway, it was really interesting to see Tolkien be so cagey about this process. It's a full 7 pages before he even says the term, the construction of imaginary languages in full or outline. It is 7 page. He gets 7 pages in before even telling the audience what exactly he's talking about, and that's he truly walked so that we could run with Dothraki and whatnot.
I think I've said this before, but I always find him hardest to deal with when he is in like scholar mode.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine reading the letters. They're very discursive and elaborate and everything, but it's still a much different experience from reading him trying to get to the point. It's like, thank God for the introduction, honestly, because like if I hadn't known going in that this introduction was that long, I would have been like, what is he talking about? When is he going to get to it?
It is it is funny, Jared. I think you and I differ where there's points at which Tolkien was clearly reading out just like tables of declensions.
Declensions, yeah.
And if I had been there, I would have just been bored out of my skull. That is like not the way I like to learn things. And so, but Jared, you have a slightly different opinion on that, I think.
I mean, kind of getting a little further afield here, but I don't do well in lecture situations.
Me neither.
I really don't.
Well, it depends on how the lecture is delivered for me.
Kind of. I think what the problem, specifically for him, when he's talking about scholarly stuff, is that he tends to meander around the point for a very long time because he's got a lot of little jokes or something that he wants to make, or he's trying to head objections off with the pass.
Oh, yeah.
In some cases.
It's very defensive.
It is which is so funny. I don't know how it would have played at the time, obviously, but now it's like, dude, just make a language. It's not, you don't have to... You don't have to defend this in the way that you are defending it, where it's like, yeah, it's the volume is called The Secret Vice. It's jokingly called The Hobby for the Home, I think, in the original. But it's like he's like joking about, oh, this little perverted secret that I have. But it's like the kind of joke that you make when you are genuinely worried somebody is going to find your interest absurd and laughable. Or maybe a little perverted.
He's very like concerned with the perversion and like, I'm sure he said this in a joking tone, but when he says, I may be like an opium smoker seeking a moral or medical or artistic defense for his habit. And it's like, even as a joke, can you chill?
Yeah, right.
What also makes it interesting, too, is the fact that if this had been an audience of his peers, I might understand it some more, but it was not. These were undergrads.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, or they were just like, or younger scholars and things like that. If anything, he could have taken the attitude of, I like doing this, tough if you don't, which he didn't. So, but he could have. So
he did that at other points, too. Like, famously, when he was still a student, I think he like came on stage at a debate club yelling in ancient Greek while in a toga or something.
Oh my God!
Like
so extra,
right? He clearly had no problem in other contexts of just being like, "I'm here. You're following my lead now." But for whatever reason, here it's much more. It's swathed in these layers and layers of like apology and self-justification and analogy.
Inventing a guy who like I don't want to accuse him of being being a liar and completely fabricating that entire little anecdote about the World War I
the little man in World War I
who says, "Oh, I'll do something with the accusative." It's like, I'm sorry, that absolutely did not happen. There's no way There's no way.
I think it happened, but it was him.
Yeah.
And I think I don't think it's calling him a liar if you're like, this is the third person now. I'm pretending that this is somebody else because, again, perverted, like, oh, this is my tee. This is like 30 Rock scene where he was confessing their horrible secrets. And it's like, I'm black. I married a Democrat. I murdered my wife. It's like, it's not a problem. It's fine.
This is a comparison. So, I mean, it is one of those cases where precisely because he's, we so much has followed in his wake that I think it's, so much of it does read as sort of like, wow, I think Oriana, you already pointed this out, it's sort of like you don't have to go this far, or at least you don't have to do this the way you're doing this. At the same time, who knows? Maybe it's the type of thing that he had tried to bring it up in other contexts before, and people gave him like, especially, who knows, especially in the UK, you what? It's just sort of like, how do you explain something that is creative? Interestingly, the whole story of, this World War I officer who was suspiciously like Tolkien saying something like this out loud to an audience is there is something sweet and hopeful about it, and there's this undercurrent as well, just pointing out that, hey, the private life of the mind goes all kinds of different directions. People are not who they seem to be. They can contain multitudes, which is lovely, but is not the point of his essay, unfortunately. So he's taking another route. And let's now step into the context of invented languages as a whole, because I mentioned the introduction. So again, Esperanto, etc. There was already this churn of the idea of an invented language happening, invented languages. And, but the difference was that in terms of something that was sort of meant for, internal creativity wherever it might go, instead was something for broader communication, theoretically a good thing. So, there's an interesting distinction to be drawn there, I suppose.
Yeah, I do find it fascinating that the invented languages like Esperanto and the others that are specifically geared towards mass communication amongst, culturally separate entities. I find it really interesting. That feels very of a piece with the movement towards the scientization of everything, where we can craft a language that is the most efficient language, let's say, and we are going to quantify it, in these ways. And Tolkien's invented languages acting as almost a backlash, or a response or a reaction to these very scientific languages that have been, kind of engineered in a lab almost, amongst a larger movement of the scientization of everything. That's just such a dumb word that I'm making up, but, it's kind of a piece with the movement that led to eugenics, of just trying to quantify what makes this thing good, looking for reasons to create the master language, that kind of thing.
To eliminate the unnecessary.
Exactly. And whereas Tolkien is like, you cannot do that. This needs to, a language needs to come from culture, which comes from myth, It is really interesting to see it as sort of a reaction.
Yeah, he was, in some ways, he was definitely part of like a reactionary backlash. Like a lot of the Inklings are very like conservative white English people. Like C.S. Lewis was having a similar reaction to other things in some of his fiction, and like, I'm not saying they were wrong in a lot of ways, because a lot of stuff they're objecting to is this kind of like dehumanization of things in the name of efficiency and eliminating the wasteful. And there's always an actual body count and that kind of thing. But I also don't want to get too into like, oh, he was right on everything forever, because
not at the same time.
But I think here he generally is.
Yeah, it's really fascinating that this comes, this is a lecture delivered to the same society that had recently had a lecture just pillorying Gertrude Stein in a way that feels awfully misogynistic.
Did they have similar one for James Joyce? Like,
Yep.
Did they? I don't know.
And and it's funny given that those were also reactions to the dehumanizing effects of scientization. They feel very like it's a reaction to the modernist movement, but also like that in and of itself is, I don't know. There's lots of layers to this. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think Femi makes this point in the introduction, but he's doing a lot of the same things like James Joyce and Gertrude Stein, where they're examining language and turning it inside out to see how it works, and using that to create works of art that work with like the substance of language itself. Like, I don't know, he's not going full Finnegan's Wake, obviously, but he is. Lord of the Rings in some ways is a similarly arduous thing to read, where you're like, I don't know what this name is. This is totally fake. This doesn't tell me anything except maybe the shape of the word hints at something, or it because of the associations that Welsh has. Sindarin is playing on some of those associations, or that Quenya has very Latin elements and pulls that. Like he's trying to communicate things that English English itself as spoken maybe is not doing, and Joyce and Stein are doing the same thing. They're just not making up languages. They're maybe coining words, but yeah. So I think I did call Lord of the Rings the first postmodern fantasy in the last episode, but it is also very much a modernist text.
A land of contrast.
It is. There's so much. It's so rich. It's a rich tapestry.
It just occurred to me too. One reason Tolkien would have liked delivering this lecture was because basically when he was reading his language, he was getting the pronunciation right. And in fact, when you think about it, one of his last notable acts he did with his legendarium before he passed was the formal poems and songs recordings of Middle Earth, where he could do in a studio a very clean, clear, this is what it sounds like things for both Quenya and Sindarin. So it's sort of like, again, I'm sure he would have loved to do it one time. What would Tolkien reading Lord of the Rings have been like if the books on tape phenomenon had happened back in the 30s or 40s? It would, as we know from Andy Serkis's recording, it would be long, but he could be assured of getting it exactly right each time as he saw it or as he felt it. And you get hints of that in the snippets of the home recordings that were done in the 50s on his friend's little home dealy thing there, which is worth listening to. Although I think it's mostly straight up English in that instead of his created languages. Getting into probably the other chief subject, keeping an eye on the time, and if you're hearing this at this point, there's no way I can get rid of it. You can definitely hear the band doing things in the background. I'm sure at this point. That's
really?
why I'm being.
I don't hear it.
I don't hear it either. So
okay, well, if that's
fine.
the case, and you're hearing this now, let's keep it staying that way. Maybe we're lucky. But namely is the fact, this idea of sound symbolism. This idea of which gets into a really weird area, because it's something that on the one hand I like the impulse. It's a very romantic with a capital R impulse. The language is the thing. And trust me, having done lots of not even linguistic theory, I should say critical theory and stuff when I was in grad school. That was a long time ago. not quite my thing, but it was a school I ended up at. So hey, and they gave me the fellowship, so of course I'd go. A different kind of fellowship. Thank you. The thing is with that is this idea that certain sounds and, dare I say, certain languages are seen to be, more proper, maybe more elevated, maybe sound better. There is something to be said about the fact that the sounds of Quenya and Sindarin in Tolkien's formulation are seen to be good sounds, let us say, whereas if you have something that's notably consonant heavy, like, I don't know, the black speech, but also maybe notably, you could argue as well, maybe Kuzdul and all that are sort of like, are these better? Are these proper? What's going on here? So, and that's a case where it's sort of like where you think about what the real world equivalents might be. It's sort of like, that's tricky. And I don't really necessarily like it per se. It's notable to me that his language his Steshan languages for the most part essentially is only talking about European languages, and with only a very quick side reference to other tongues. A brief mention of Japanese here, a note in his separate little notes on phonetic symbolism about Africa there, in a very Africa as a country
Yeah,
vibe,
the monolith
which is like,
that is
I don't think
yeah.
so, my friend.
There aren't like several different huge language families in just
No, not at all.
No, not in the least.
No.
So stuff like that is on the one hand, you look. That's where the value of this critical edition comes in handy. It casts a properly gimlet eye on that. On the other hand, it is worth coming from in terms of understanding that this was a big creative impulse for him, and feeds into why he was constructing the sounds, the names, as we were talking about names in the news section, the importance of getting these names right, of getting things to sound the way they do. It may be a limited specific aesthetic on the one hand, that's artificially constructed in the end, but at the same time, he is working it out as much thorough detail as he absolutely possibly can.
The thing about sound symbol. Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
I will forget this if I don't say it right now.
No, say it now.
The thing about sound symbolism, it's a lot of things actually, but I would say, first of all, he's not entirely wrong about how it works. Is the thing. It is, I would say it's more like one thing on the palette that you can build a language out of. It's not the whole of language in itself. But people do have this association of sounds and things. Like famously, there's that experiment where they showed people two shapes, one spiky, one blobby, and two words, Kiki and Booba, and said, which of these words goes with this shape? And across the sample size, everybody was like, Kiki is the spiky shape, and Booba, or Boba, or whatever, is the blobby shape. So there's something innate to it, but it's also, I wouldn't go as far as he tends to, where it's like, yes, this syllable is the essence of something, or the other things that he does with this, like, he's not wrong, he's not entirely right, he's going where I can't follow in some ways, but he's not wrong. So
yeah, I think within it helps to talk within a language itself, because like we'll never know the origins of languages. Like it's just not possible. We can try, but it's just not going to happen. But languages have their own aesthetic. Like, it is something that you can just hear, the Japanese aesthetic, which is different from the Finnish aesthetic. And it is interesting that he's so focused on European languages, and like Finland is part of Europe, but the Finnish language is outside of the Indo-European language family. It is in an entirely separate language family. And it is interesting to me that he still kind of lumps it in, not academic, but like the sound-wise, despite, Russian is part of the Indo-European family, and it's notably different. Although I've noticed some possible crossover with Finnish and Russian in terms of some of their sounds. That's really interesting. But
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they were just loan words by default. I'm sure, just because the fact that
I think it's loan sounds. Even there was just crossover at some point that influenced one or both. I have a theory. This is not a very academically sound theory, but it is just a thing that kind of popped into my brain.
I would say that, there is no denying that this lecture is extremely Eurocentric.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, and like stated almost, it is Eurocentric. But part of that, I think, it's very easy to blame him for some things. But I think in this case, he's talking about what he knows. He's not the kind of person who will go on and on about stuff that he does not know. He will go on and on and on and on about stuff he does know, but he's not just going to make stuff up. And because he was familiar with the languages of Europe, I don't think I don't know, but I'm not sure that he ever studied really anything originating outside of the Indo-European family. He's not gonna be like, well, the Uto Aztec language family does
or Navajo
or Navajo. I think that's part of the whatever. Anyway, he's not going to talk about languages that he doesn't know. and he just happens to know a lot of European ones, which is going to reinforce some of his own bias.
Right. It's the bias comes in not seeking out the very different languages of, the Korean Peninsula.
Of literally anywhere else.
Yeah. Right. And, it also... I don't want to be a things were different, but like you couldn't just Wikipedia stuff back in the day. You had to like, unless you traveled to a place or lived near a population that spoke a lot of different other languages. It was difficult to be exposed, to be properly exposed to other languages in a really far outside your own language family.
Well, he kind of, if I'm remembering the tone correctly, maybe it's in here, it might be a different piece of his. He talks about discovering this book of Finnish grammar, and the way he talks about it is like almost like miraculous that it was even there to be read.
Yeah,
I think it was at Oxford, and they, Oxford probably had at the time people who spoke, other language, like experts in Chinese or whatever. But unless he seeks them out. Right. And that's on him.
That is on him.
It is more work than just being like, Wikipedia, tell me how Armenian does the past tense.
Tell me, he was not, Tolkien was not living in Glendale where, like, all I hear is Armenian.
If only he had thought to do that, so.
If only he'd moved to Glendale.
Moved to Glendale, California, not Arizona.
Trying to imagine the alternate course of Tolkien's life. You come British academic over here. That would have been in Southern California. I'm suddenly getting interesting visions of how things might have turned out, actually.
I am surprised he didn't base Mordor on, like, Nevada.
Hey, Maida, that actually talking about Armenian kind of reminds me, going back to sound symbolism and aesthetics and like Kuzdul and black speech and all that, they're very consonant heavy, have a lot of closed syllables, like consonant, vowel, consonant. But also, at the same time, Westron and Adunaic both do that a lot. And those are also very prominent. So I don't... This is another thing you kind of get dinged for, is like, oh yeah, the evil languages look like people of color speak them, that kind of... But he was basing other, like, quote, good languages. God, I hate being forced to talk like this, but, it is, as always, a little more complicated. There are the consonant-heavy languages of the good people. Good people. Like, so it's complicated. Anyway, but Adunaic, I think, specifically and explicitly is based on Semitic languages. So it's...
As is Kuzdul.
Yeah,
too.
I think that's much more specifically Hebrew rather than generally Semitic.
Yeah.
All right. And you can read into that what you will. Keeping an eye on the time, it's about time to wrap up. So I'm going to just read apart from the conclusion of the lecture, which I think is good because it shows that even though Tolkien was arguably sort of arguing for this sort of ideal state of language, he actually recognized the limits of the difference between creating something and having it work versus how language actually works, which is good. So we need more of that, you could say. So here's the section. In poetry of our day, when the use of significant language is so habitual that the word form is seldom consciously marked, and the associated notions have it almost all their own way, it is the interplay and pattern of the notions adhering to each word that is uppermost. The word music, according to the nature of the tongue, and the skill or ear, conscious or artless, of the poet, runs on heard but seldom coming to awareness. Rare moments we pause to wonder why a line or couplet produces an effect beyond its significance we call the authentic magic of the poet, or some such meaningless expression. So little do we ponder word form in sound music beyond a few hasty observations of its crudest manifestations in rhyme and alliteration, that we are unaware often that the answer is simply that by luck or skill the poet has struck out an air which illuminates the line like a sound of music half attended to may deepen the significance of some unrelated thought or read while the music ran. And in a living language, this is all the more poignant because the language is not constructed to do this, and only by rare felicity will it say what we wish it to, significantly, and at the same time sing carelessly. So I think that's a very interesting note for him to sort of wrap up on, and for us to wrap up on as well. As with many of our other discussions, this is a starting point. There's plenty to come back to in terms of language, and now that we've finally sort of introduced it to our discussions here, and we will yet have more to say along the way. But until then, ponder that, and I hope too much of the band hasn't come in through the background there while I'm playing, but who knows? Who knows?
You could have started like spoken word poetry to it. Right?
Yeah, right? We can read the Arundel passage to the
beat.
I'm sure someone out there has already done that, and I'm not going to look for it. Looking ahead, it is time to think about our next episode. The turn has come around to Oriana's. Oriana, what are we doing?
I feel like I default to character studies a lot, but we're gonna do it again, and this time we're gonna look at Legolas because who is this guy? This Sindarin elf raised amongst the Sylvan elves, just kind of a pouty little prince sometimes. Often
Himbo
cutting, like, what is his deal? We're gonna
what
talk
does he
about
even look like.
What does he look like?
Well,
Why?
obviously he's hot, so
obviously,
yeah.
But what kind of hot?
Right? He's not like is Legolas a himbo? I say no, but maybe some other people say yes. Yeah. So we'll talk all things Legolas, Greenleaf in the next episode.
We will indeed. And yes, so basically at this point, again, whatever edit I do, you may or may not hear snippets, but basically I've been listening to some band just endlessly cover the Doors at this point now for about an hour.
Oh no!
Yeah, no, trust me, the whole time I'm like going like, speaking of poets or people who thought they were. So I have my own feelings on this matter. So I'm a music critic in another life, don't forget that. So and I'm like, I want to escape. So I will. So I'll let you all go. It's again a bit of a rough ride to have to go through an episode once more. We've done this twice now. Hopefully never again. We'll try and remember to get our backup recordings in place. Sorry about that, Chris, our overlord and master of the Megaphonic folks, and our initial editor of these tracks. But we appreciate it. We appreciate you listening. Yes, 2 months to go until the Rings of Power. It's all coming fast and thick here. But we'll have Legacy to talk about next time, and we'll see where things go after that. And we'll see what new news we have on that front as well. I'm sure there will be more, and we'll find out all sorts of strange things too, including more bizarre Harfoot names or something. I don't know.
No.
You know, they still haven't identified all the characters yet from those
initial.
God,
really?
Yeah, no, those initial images of like without they just show people's hands and faces. In fact, that's something that we didn't talk about. Did we talk about how Caleb Brimbor got identified and he looks like a newscaster? That's a whole other thing.
It is cursed.
Yeah.
It is. We will get to that because that's only occurred to me. I'm like, oh yeah, that was weird. Nothing against the actor. The actor's good.
The actor's great. He's so good in The Terror.
Yeah, he's in that. Charles something. We'll throw in a link in the show notes. But oh my goodness, we have questions, but we'll get to that. We will see how it plays out. So until next time, have yourself a good July. Get through it all, and we'll talk to you in a few weeks. Until then. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.